The great books of ancient Greece, classical Greece, are really the best place to start, I think, in a chronological survey of what we call the great books. I've got a previous video in this series, it'll be in this playlist, about why bother reading the great books at all. What are the great books? The great books are a disputed approach to engaging with important literature in the West, that is to say in Europe, particularly Western and Southern Europe, and also the English-speaking world outside of Europe. And to some degree perhaps also Spanish and French-speaking worlds, but particularly the English-speaking world outside of Europe. So this idea that you have a tradition and a body of works which informs us of where we've come from, and of who our cultural mother is, and hopefully the fact that though it is narrow and limited, because we can't read every book, so when we're looking for really big important works, it gives us a guide. By learning to respect our own mother, it helps us to respect other people's mothers too. It shows us that cultural traditions of all kinds are important. So classical Greece. In fact, I'm really going to be talking about two periods of time if we're talking about normal historical boundaries: Archaic and Classical Greece. Sometimes you just see all of that as Classical Greece. Basically, you have in Greek history, very quickly, you have a great pre-classical, pre-Dark Age, high antique Greece. The Mycenaean Age, sometimes called, but it spreads before the heyday of the city of Mycenae. It also importantly includes the Minoan civilization in lots of ways, despite the fact they didn't speak Greek. You know, there's a great connection between the Minoans and mainland Greeks, despite some significant differences. But this is the culture which we really take a lot of Greek legend from: minotaurs in labyrinths, Knossos, and the Trojan War, a war waged by the king of Mycenae on behalf of his brother, the king of Sparta, against Troy, which seems to be halfway between a Greek city in Asia and something else again. But all this society is destroyed. And then there is a Dark Age in Greece. And Dark Age in the way that we sometimes, and we exaggerate these terms, but we sometimes use the term of, let's say, Western Europe, particularly Western and Northern Europe, from 476 or 531 or whatever it is, through to the Carolingian and Charlemanic unification, and also the House of Wessex in England, the unification of Northern Europe, and also the Visigoths resisting invasion to the south, which would have brought in a quite advanced but different culture. This idea that you have a European culture that collapses and is destroyed, and then rises again with fragments of that. And you have the same with Greece. With Greece, you have a culture that collapses due to potentially invasion, potentially plague, potentially many things. And then what rises out of that is a different Greek culture. They speak the same language as their Mycenaean forebears, but they end up having a different script, the Greek script. The Greeks today still use it. And this is about, let's say, 800 or so, Archaic Greece begins. That's to say, when you start to have the first advanced, more or less literate societies spreading across mainland Greece and into Asia Minor, Ionia, the coast there, the Aeolian coast, things like that as well. Basically, the tribes, this is a specialist term in this context, of Greeks begin to spread across the sea and settle a great deal of the coast of what is now called Turkey. And this is the rise of Archaic Greece. And importantly, we think of it in terms of it's the rise of Homer, whether one author or two or many. It's a time where you start to get Greek literature again, which in fact in many ways is harking back to both before the Dark Age and the Dark Age in terms of what it deals with. There's then another boundary. Archaic Greece is a time of increasing political unity and security and therefore wealth, literacy, and colonization, things like that. But then in either 510 or 480, the two most common dates, there are others, a new era flourishes, rises, the era of classical Greece, and this lasts to about 323 BC, which is the death of Alexander the Great. And just to give context to those dates, 510 is the overthrow of the last Athenian tyrant and the installation of the Athenian democracy, which is Athens' main form of government going forward. And this is a kind of like our democracy in terms of there's an assembly with voting, but it's also something else entirely. The idea that those who are citizens go, and it can be randomly sorted into jobs. So it's direct, but it also has this odd, peculiar system of raising up men to do roles, and they take responsibility, including financial responsibility for this really remarkable, unique, mad system that also makes Athens the cultural and at points political power in the Eastern Mediterranean for much of that time. 480 is the defeat of the first Persian invasions of Europe with Plataea, the kind of the great Persian wars of that period. And it's when you're talking about the idea that Greece has reached its maturity, it has defeated its great eastern rival, who in fact controls many Greek lands but not mainland Greece, and it now takes an increasingly dominant position. And it ends with the beginning of what we call the Hellenistic period. 323, the death of Alexander. Alexander's father, Philip, had basically conquered Greece, particularly at the Crocus Field, after the Battle of the Crocus Field. Alexander continues that. But there, the sense is that when Alexander dies, you start to have warring kingdoms, including, ultimately, it's the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia itself and that surrounding area. And there are some other dynasties based in and around Greece. And you have Pyrrhus of Epirus going off, and who's general in these wars, going off and fighting eventually in Italy against the rising Romans. You have a different era. Classical Greece has ended, and you have these great Greek-speaking powers in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you have the rise of Rome in the Western Mediterranean. So that's the period we're talking about, Archaic and Classical Greece. Why should we read works from classical Greece then? So I've said that the great books, there are many virtues, I think, to the approach. Partly there's a selection mechanism. We end up reading good books, worthwhile books, interesting books, because you can't read everything. And this is one way of selecting worthwhile things to read that many people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people have approved before. And not just tens of thousands of people now you pick off the street, then maybe that's a good way to pick for you, but tens of thousands of people who have read widely and who have reflected upon the matter. It's something where there's different methods of selecting, and that's one. As to the kind of ancestry, the cultural background, the cultural motherhood, there are many influences of what goes into what we call Western civilization. And of course, within that, just as there are many things that go into Chinese civilization or Indian civilization or whatever, these are all vague phrases as well, because there are many traditions within those contexts as well. Ask a Frenchman and he'll give a different list of books you need to read, sort of thing. But the point is that Greece and Rome, and in a different context, the literatures of the ancient Near East, most notably the Hebrew and to a much lesser degree the Egyptian literature, are the chief wellsprings in literary terms, and also the expression of politics and religion and history and all the other things in written form that show us the kind of cultural DNA, the mimetic DNA, if you want to put it that way, the things that have influenced and built up this culture. And so when we think about, okay, well, I want to know about this, well, those are the places to go. And I think Greece is a natural place to start. Maybe the other natural place to start would be particularly the Old Testament and Hebrew literature. And there will be, we'll talk about that in a future video, the literature of the ancient Near East. But Greece would be the other place. And I think Greece has things about it which seem very seminal in terms of what the self-understanding of Western culture from that time onwards in a quite distinct way. Religiously, we naturally look to the Judeo-Christian traditions as the single biggest influence, but culturally and politically and intellectually, it's natural, I think, and proper to look to Greece as the chief, but not sole, but chief font. It is the great influence upon all those cultures that come afterwards, and is one of the two great languages of learning for a very long period of time. With Latin actually largely replacing it for complex historical reasons, but Greek then making a comeback. It continues to be the language of the Roman Empire until 1453. It continues to be the language of a powerful Roman Empire in the East until the 1300s AD. It is an exceptionally the Roman emperor would have, when he said Constantine the 11th, the empire has fallen, but the emperor is not, as he charged into the Ottomans and into legend. He would have thought of himself as one of the Romaioi, one of the Romans, the emperor of the Romans indeed. So the point is that this is this vastly influential literature. It's chronologically the earliest that we really have access to in Europe. That we have parallel. We have a few very tiny fragments of sort of functionally Basque, kind of early Hispanic sort of writing, and a few other bits of writing here and there. Some indecipherable stuff in northern Italy. But this is this literature which also takes us all the way back to Mycenae as well, because the language is the same. Once we had deciphered Linear B, the kind of the semi-idiomatic and syllabic language or script of Greece before the Dark Ages, before the Greek Dark Ages, we realise they're the same language, and there's a shared cultural tradition which we see in Homer. So this takes us all the way back to 1250, 1300, 1500 and before. It takes us back to the slightly different and more alien culture of Minos, of Crete. So I think it's natural for us to go there. Now, what I want to do for the rest of today, this video, is to talk about the major texts and to talk about why you might find them interesting, maybe some of how to access them, just a couple. I think I've got a half dozen or so, just short readings to give you some sense and flavour of who we're dealing with. Now, one thing is we have a significant number of minor fragmentary authors, all sorts of things, and also, if we go all the way back to Mycenae, we have records of how many horses people had. That's basically what we have from that period. Is these were not a poetic people in ancient Mycenae. Agamemnon did not speak quite so beautifully in real life. But there are fewer fairly complete authors. It's actually a fairly compact canon. I have virtually all of it next to me in terms of all the major authors in I think 20 books or so. We're talking about an incredibly small body comparatively. Vast amounts are lost. Vastly more than in the Roman world. It's a shame in some senses, though. That's not to be too harsh on these Roman authors, but we have a great number of AD period Roman authors who are perfectly okay or interesting, but second rate really. Whereas before that period, we have great authors who we have large amounts missing from, including Latin authors. I'll talk about that in a different era, different video too. But particularly from that Greek era, particularly from the classical Greek era, there are more Hellenistic authors functioning. There's much more Hellenistic literature from 323 through to around the time of Christ, and afterwards, counting all remaining Greek language material. There's much more of that stuff than there is the classical Greek period, despite the fact that in many respects it does seem to us that the classical Greek period is superior. It's more intensely focused and innovative and creative in distinct ways than that later area, the Hellenistic period. But nonetheless, that one advantage of this is it means that our survey can be fairly narrow. Rather than saying, okay, well, there's literally dozens of authors who you might need to read if you really want to be very complete on this, and if you're counting every Greek language author through to the fall of Rome, but these are the 10. Actually, we can just say, look, we'll talk about every major author to some degree or another today. And there are a few reasons we consider people major authors, and one is the accident of being complete. They must be a major author for us because we have significant work by them. And there is a selection bias then. They're the ones we have. So, and basically none of these of whom we have large remains are awful or bad. None of it is this kind of... And there is the thing, I think of Caesar's civil wars, that the first part, the Greek campaign essentially is written by Caesar as campaign material. Caesar dies, of course. It's continued in the African War by some sort of legate, someone who's fairly educated, and it's a bit different. And then that's continued by the Spanish War, which is by some centurion who doesn't really understand the geography he's dealing with. He goes off on weird tangents. And the point is, that's something which is still valuable history to us, but it's not just second rate, it's perhaps fifth rate. We don't have that with our great surviving classical Greek authors. So we are fortunate in our selection, but it is a selection nonetheless that we haven't chosen, but history has chosen. But the second reason why we consider these major authors more justly is that the selection isn't wholly accidental. In most cases, it is because, not all, but in most cases, it is due to large-scale copying of works. And works which had more copies are more likely to survive. If there's only one copy of you're an ancient Greek poet, and you have the scribes make, 20 copies or something, and that's in ancient Athens, and they get destroyed over time, and no one ever copies them again because they're not that good. Well, we don't have them now, probably. On the other hand, if you're an important author or people really value you culturally, then copies are made. Many copies are made. And this is actually why we have, for many ancient writers, their first surviving manuscripts are from 700 or 1000 AD. And this sounds crazy and unreliable, and textual studies is a whole thing. But the point is, this is part of the tradition of how often they are being copied, how valued they are. And particularly you see in terms of our survivals from the Byzantine period, we can see how popular these works are then. That's one reason they survive, is because they're popular then. So there's a selection bias that points us towards authors generally agreed to be important. Now, I should say that's not 100%. It's not that I'm saying, okay, well, it's sad we've lost all the stuff, but we have definitely got the 20 or 30, whatever it is, really great authors who really matter. And we've got all their important work. We don't. We're missing important works by named authors. And you see that, for instance, that we only have one surviving trilogy of tragic, dramatic plays from ancient Athens, which, that is to say, the Oresteia by Aeschylus. Whereas, say, Sophocles, he wrote 3 plays about Oedipus and his family, and they're sometimes collected together. I think I have a collection of them there. But they're not from the same trilogies. They're all from different ones. Everything else has been lost from those trilogies because that was how they wrote them. Or again, this is a point that Sir Arthur Quiller Couch makes when he kind of somewhat is teasing this idea that it's about copying, meaning importance. Is he says, well, look, the most famous Athenian comedian in terms of the strict comic drama of the time, comic plays of the time, none of his stuff survives. We don't have anything. We have Aristophanes, but this guy beat him to the prize. So can we really rely on that being the most important stuff? And yes, you can come up with examples like that. But the point is that, generally speaking, what has survived is good and valuable, and was valued and has always been valued. And so in terms of what we have to read, that's what we have to read. A fairly small, you can collect it all in your 20 or 30 volumes or so. Fairly small collection of these authors, and you can read it all if you like. You perhaps will not, but the point is that it's there and it's accessible and it's worth looking at. Now, one interesting thing, and this is call it more of a historical perspective, is that I've already hinted at some of this, but for much of recorded Western history, say the history of Greece, Rome, and onwards in the West, so from 800 onwards to now, written history in the West, is we didn't have many of these works for long periods of time. Basically, even you see this increasingly, even at a point where the Greek East and the Latin West converse and are in communication, you do see limitations on what people are reading and in what language, even then. And I think this is particularly important in the early church, but particularly after the fall of Rome and the waves of kind of what we call Germanic, but also of sort of Hunnic peoples coming over, these various invading barbarian people who are usually not initially literate. They perhaps are partly civilized by Roman and post-Roman culture. These people sweep in, and there is a dark age that falls upon Europe, and as Lord Clark says, we got through by the skin of our teeth. The point is that we didn't in the West have access on the whole to loads of these works. I know particularly that we had essentially nothing of Aristotle for a very long period, for maybe 600, 700, 800 years, let's say 700 years. And of Plato, we chiefly had the Timaeus. We did not have Plato's, though that is a famous work, we didn't have his really most famous works, things like the Republic or the Laws or the Euthyphro. These really, and that's a shorter one, but really a very good place to start. We didn't have these incredibly important works. And so we're talking about the great underpinnings of what we can, I think, fairly call the Western intellectual tradition, which simply didn't exist. For a lot of people speaking Proto-German, Proto-French, Proto-Spanish, whose official language was Latin. The Greek-speaking world, which was somewhat severed by the fall of Rome, still had those works. Now, those works were rediscovered in many ways, and it's worth saying quickly, the main ways were finding them in monastery libraries. Many of them did survive in the West, we just didn't know. Finding them much later in, for instance, the Egyptian desert, finding in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, all the way into the, you've got major finds still going on. In fact, here's one of the most exciting things. This isn't about Greek language stuff, but is using AI to decode the vulcanized library, a vast library found at Herculaneum, where it looks like the first text to be deciphered is a philosopher of one of the great schools of that time. And that perhaps we're now going to find a vast library just of this stuff. That'd be disappointing if it was just that. But the point is that's very exciting that we can still do that now. So archaeology is another way. Another way was refugees from the Greek-speaking world heading west from, say, 1204 onwards, from the unfortunate conquest of Constantinople by the Venetians and Franks, through to 1453, the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans. Through that period, you have wave after wave of Greeks coming west, and particularly in the 1400s, and spurring on the Renaissance. And that leads to another source of, finding things, is particularly when we found them either from Byzantine sources or from monastery sources. You have these new scholars who are continuing to translate them. And a final source of these, and this is one way that Aristotle particularly headed back into the sort of Central and Western European cultures, and really it starts from the southern flank. It is via periods of interchange with civilized and intelligent and wealthy and powerful Muslim civilization in southern Spain and Andalusia. These advanced, intellectually advanced nations who have philosophical traditions which are influenced by Aristotle, who has survived via the Arab conquests, has survived in Muslim hands. So those are our sources. That's what survived. That's why it survived. The fact it's an ongoing process is exciting. A question before we consider the remains themselves. Do you need Greek to read these? You know, when you come to your Homer, do you need Greek to enjoy it at all? Well, the answer to that is no. You don't need Greek to enjoy it at all. And I think with many of these authors, Greek, and I will make a video about Greek and Latin, but with many of these authors, Greek is very much a secondary concern for you, knowing the language. And I say that because though there will be things you miss, and though there are disputed passages and this and that and the other, an important point is that if you're reading a good translation of Plato or Aristotle, then hopefully you're grasping arguments and illustrations with a bit of help from perhaps the editor. And that's something which can operate at a level where the aesthetics are secondary. Hopefully it is a mellifluous translation, if that's appropriate. But the point is that you don't need to be like, oh wow, that was the most moving aesthetic experience ever. It's more complicated, of course, with poetry and drama, and to some degree oratory, but particularly poetry and drama. And this is because obviously there are things to do with the it's quite hard, for reasons that I've discussed elsewhere. It's quite hard to translate Greek verse into English one for one. Basically, Greek and Latin meters, because of the nature of those languages, are very much more regular than the way that English meter works. And what rhyme patterns and metrical patterns work best in each language is different. And that means that, and also the way that words compress. Basically, you're generally communicating a lot more through a word in Greek or in Latin than you are in inflected languages, than you are in more flexible, arguably, languages in terms of their kind of their linguistic range, but like English, and so that makes it a hard translation. And it means you have all kinds of translation choices to make when you're reading the poets. You have with anything, of course. There are, I'm thinking about Kierkegaard actually, but you get massive arguments about which Kierkegaard should you be reading, because he's such a poetic author. There's a fitting comparison there. He's such an aesthetically challenging author. And I think that's the point with this. Do you read E.V. Rieu's quite classic prose translation of the Iliad and Odyssey? Do you read Latimore? Do you read an older verse? Do you read, and there's many other verse translations, or do you read Robert Fagel's a slightly more modern and very lyrical and immediate translation, but which is going to be less literal than some of these others? And you get the same debates about all these ancient texts. So yes, you've got to make those decisions, and with poetry and with drama, where aesthetic effect matters more for full appreciation, you are going to benefit if you read it in Greek, but I do not think it's necessary. And a proof of that is that I will typically be reading these works in English because it's easier, and if I can find a good translator of something, then I know I'm going to enjoy it. I'm not going to need to be like, oh, I need to go and spend the time parsing stuff and working through stuff, and really trying to get there. Someone who's not a top-rate linguist. So yeah, you do not need Greek for these. Let's start. I've got 4 heads here. We'll talk poetry, drama, philosophy, and history / oratory / politics, because they're all interrelated. So poetry is chronologically where we start, and this is because in the Greek Archaic period, this is where you have particularly Homer and Hesiod rising, and just we've talked about essentially surviving Greek poetry from the Archaic and Classical periods is here. This is all you would need. Most famously, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are I have a couple more translations knocking around, but these are the Fagles translations, which I quite enjoy. I think they're quite effective most of the time, though there are some problems with that. I also have a Fagles translation of Bacchylides, who's not a bad way into something called the lyric poets. We'll talk about that momentarily. The Homeric hymns. This is a Penguin one with a translation by Jules Cashford. Hesiod, the Theogony and the Working Days, and this has Theognis' Elegies, translated by Dorothea Wender. Anthony Verity translating Pindar's Odes. So Bacchylides and Pindar, both writing odes, both large remains of them. And Greek lyric poetry, otherwise, this excludes Pindar, this particular edition, Pindar and Bacchylides, by M.L. West. This is, this is the kind of spread of what remains, and you have vast epic works, and you have very much occasional poetry, personal poetry, comic poetry, and you have great celebratory poetry, both religious and sporting, and the two are connected, of course, in Greek times. And now, go to a football match and you'll find a great religious ceremony ongoing. Now, as I say, this is something where you could quite reasonably, if this is what you wanted to, you could read all this, depending on your reading speed, you could read this in a year, you could read this in 6 months. There'll be some people who can crack out reading Homer, particularly, who's probably the absolute majority of the words in these collections, can crack out reading Homer in a couple of months and then fit the rest in for dessert. But yes, you have a few different major types of poetry here. I think, am I potentially missing here? There may be, that there are a few other hexametrical poems and poets not included in what I've shown here, because hexameter is not in the kind of the lyric and iambic traditions. These are basically all these things the Greeks defined their verse by are to do with either meter, essentially how long are lines. The most easiest way to think about it usually is how long are lines, and how many, and are there verse forms, or how long is the average subgroup within a line. In English, the most famous one is the iambic pentameter, which is 5 feet, 5 segments, and the foot in those cases, the base foot is the iamb. I've talked about a bit of some of these things in my amateurish way in Poem of the Week videos. So yes, there are literally actually a couple of the hexametrical documents, not in what we're talking about here. But chiefly you have the epic poets, and that's Homer and Hesiod. These are poets dealing with the great legendary elements at a high level, with the Iliad and the Odyssey. Hesiod has how did everything come about? The tales of the gods. The Homeric hymns, which are not by Homer but have been attributed to him, which are religious hymns, and so you can see they connect directly to, say, the Theogony, which is about the gods, by Hesiod. And then you have a broader category of, aside from a few surviving philosophical pieces, which I actually will, some of them will be included, though they're in verse, they'll be included under philosophy, because that's what they're written as. The point is that we have, we have very few of those that are not otherwise philosophic, but we have this other category which we'll call, generally speaking, the lyric poets. Poets who wrote for delight, and some of it's love poetry, famously Sappho, for instance. There's some of that there. There is, to be fair, philosophic poetry in those more casual rhyme forms, and things like by Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens. You have certainly some political poetry and some satiric poetry, people like Simonides. So yes, you've got a lot of things going on in that kind of category. And one subcategory of that, which is exceptionally important, is the ode. And essentially, think the Olympic ode is not merely the Olympic ode, also the Nemean, the Pythian. Generally speaking, the ode celebrating victorious sportsmen. And this is big business because these are major religious and cultural rituals that everyone really enjoys. They're major things. They are the Olympics, particularly, is a symbol of the peace of Greece, the unity of Greece, the way in which a politically disunited set of peninsulas is in fact, and colonies as far west as France and as far east as the modern Crimea, the Chersonese and so on. These places are united and they ought to be at peace with each other. And so these are our major things. And two of our significant surviving poets, Pindar and Bacchylides, are known for that. Let's read a couple of quotes. Let's read, and we'll take a few minutes on these. And this is, and there may be some reflection as well, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of things you might get as we come along here. Let's read a couple of pages of the Iliad. This is Fegel's translation of the Iliad, which, as I say, it has a slightly more casual and bouncing tone to it, which, and Fegel's, some of his works people prefer to others. He was a profligate translator. Many important Greek works translated by him. So, if you like his style, you can get more. So, Hector has returned to Troy and is sorting stuff out after the failed duel between Paris and Menelaus, and he's setting up sacrifices, he's doing this and that, and then his wife is upset, and at that Hector spun and rushed from his house, back by the same way down the wide, well-paved streets throughout the city until he reached the Scaean gates, the last point he would pass to gain the field of battle. There his warm, generous wife came running up to meet him, Andromache, the daughter of gallant-hearted Eetion, who had lived below Mount Plakos, rich with timber, and Thebe below the peaks, and ruled Cilicia's people. His daughter had married Hector, helmed in bronze. She joined him now, and following in her steps a servant, holding the boy against her breast, in the first flush of life only a baby. Hector's son, the darling of his eyes, and radiant as a star. Hector would always call the boy Scamandrius. Townsmen called him Astyanax, lord of the city, since Hector was the lone defence of Troy. This great man of war was breaking into a broad smile, his gaze fixed on his son in silence. Andromache, pressing close beside him and weeping freely now, clung to his hand, urged him, called him, reckless one, my Hector, your own fiery courage will destroy you. Have you no pity for him, our helpless son, or me, and the destiny that weighs me down, your widow, now so soon? Yes, soon they'll kill you off, all the Achaean forces massed for assault, and then, bereft of you, better for me to sink beneath the earth. What other warmth, what comfort's left for me? Once you've met your doom, nothing but torment. I have lost my father. Mother's gone as well. Father, the brilliant Achilles laid him low when he stormed Cilicia's city, filled with people, Thebe with her towering gates. He killed Eetion, not that he stripped his gear, he had some respect at least, for he burned his corpse in all his blazoned bronze, then heaped a grave mound high above the ashes, and nymphs of the mountain planted elms around it, daughters of Zeus, whose shield is storm and thunder. And the 7 brothers I had within our halls, all on the same day went down to the house of death. The great godlike runner Achilles butchered them all, tending their shambling oxen, shining flocks. And mother, who ruled under the timberline of woody Plakos once, he no sooner hailed her here with his other plunder than he took a priceless ransom, set her free, and home she went to her father's royal halls, where Artemis, showering arrows, shot her down. You, Hector, you are my father now, my noble mother, a brother too, and you are my husband, young and warm and strong. Pity me, please. Take your stand on the rampart here before you orphan your son and make your wife a widow. Draw your armies up where the wild fig tree stands, there where the city lies most open to assault, the walls lower, easily overrun. 3 times they have used that point, hoping to storm Troy. Their best fighters, led by the great and little Ajax, famous Idomeneus, Atreus' sons, valiant Diomedes. Perhaps the skilled prophet revealed the spot, or their own fury whips them on to attack. And tall Hector nodded, his helmet flashing. All this weighs in my mind too, dear woman, but I would die of shame to face the men of Troy, and the Trojan women trailing their long robes, if I would shrink from battle now, a coward. Nor does the spirit urge me on that way. I've learned it too well, to stand up bravely, always to fight in the front rank of Trojan soldiers, winning my father great glory, glory for myself. For in my heart and my soul I also know this well. The day will come when sacred Troy must die, Priam must die, and all his people with him, Priam who hurls the strong ash spear. Even so it is less the pain of the Trojans still to come that weighs me down, not even of Hecuba herself or King Priam, or the thought that my own brothers, in all their numbers, all their gallant courage, may tumble in the dust, crushed by enemies. That is nothing, nothing beside your agony, when some brazen Argive hails you off in tears, wrenching away your light and freedom. Then far off in the land of Argos you must live, labouring at a loom at another woman's beck and call, fetching water at some spring, Messias or Hyperia resisting it all the way, the rough yoke of necessity at your neck. And a man may say, who sees you streaming tears, there is the wife of Hector, the bravest fighter they could field, those stallion-breaking Trojans, long ago when the men fought for Troy. So he will say, and the fresh grief will swell your heart once more, widowed, robbed of the one man strong enough to fight off your day of slavery. No, no, let the earth come piling over my dead body before I hear your cries. I hear you dragged away. In the same breath, shining Hector reached down for his son, but the boy recoiled, cringing against his nurse's full breast, screaming out at the sight of his own father, terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge of the helmet nodding, bristling terror, so it struck his eyes. And his loving father laughed, his mother laughed as well, and glorious Hector, quickly lifting the helmet from his head, set it down on the ground, fiery in the sunlight, and raising his son, he kissed him, tossed him in his arms, lifting a prayer to Zeus and the other deathless gods. Zeus, all you immortals, grant this boy, my son, may be like me, first in glory among the Trojans, strong and brave like me, and rule all Troy in power, and one day let them say, he is a better man than his father, when he comes home from battle, bearing the bloody gear of the mortal enemy he has killed in war, a joy to his mother's heart. So Hector prayed, and placed his son in the arms of his loving wife. Andromache pressed the child to her scented breast, smiling through her tears. Her husband noticed, and filled with pity now, Hector stroked her gently, trying to reassure her, repeating her name. Andromache, dear one, why so desperate? Why so much grief for me? No man will hurl me down to death against my fate, and fate no one alive has ever escaped her. Neither brave man nor coward, I tell you, it's born with us the day that we are born, so please go home and tend your own tasks, the distaff and the loom, and keep the women working hard as well. As for the fighting, men will see to that, all who are born in Troy, but I most of all. Hector, a flash in arms, took up his horsehair-crested helmet once again, and his loving wife went home, turning, glancing back again, and weeping live, warm tears. She quickly reached the sturdy house of Hector, man-killing Hector, and found her women gathered there inside, and stirred them all to a high pitch of mourning. So in his house they raised the dirges for the dead, for Hector still alive. His people were so convinced that never again would he come home from battle, never escape the Argives' rage and bloody hands. There is so much contained there in this thrilling passage, I think. And it's thrilling despite not being a scene of action. There are many thrilling scenes of action, many famous moving moments in the Iliad. But it's a moment for me that sums up lots of things that are particularly precious in the poetry, particularly, of Archaic and Classical Greece. And by that, I particularly refer to this sense of a balance between a heroic tradition, where the thing for Astyniax is that one day he will come home in the blood of battle with the gear of his enemy for his mother. There's this heroic tradition which is uneasily balancing with a humane tradition. The fact that Hector is a civilized man in a way that most, even the great Diomedes, who is actually the Greek hero. The Greek hero is not Achilles, though he is the most important. He's the central character. But Diomedes is the most heroic and perfect Greek, and he's an honourable and noble Greek. But Hector has this civilized heart, and he sees a tension between these duties. He wishes he could stay home. And he doesn't wish he could stay home in the way that his somewhat lazy, courageous, but also lazy brother Paris would rather stay home with Helen. But Hector knows he has to go back. And there's this wonderful moment with his son, but it's counterpointed with the fact that for his son to be a better man than he he will also need to be a victorious warrior. But the passage also includes all these other things going on, like Andromache talking of the killing of her father and her 7 brothers by Achilles, and the fact that Achilles honours the dead Eetion. And this is not what will happen to Hector. Hector will be slain by Achilles. Hector, the greatest Trojan, greater in his moment than any Greek other than Achilles. Achilles will slay him, and Achilles will desecrate his corpse and only return it for proper burial at the heartbreaking plea of Priam. Hector is a prophet as well. He sees the doom of Troy, and he sees the fate of his wife, and the fate of his wife will connect to other great legend cycles, the Oresteia, that is to say, by Aeschylus. We'll turn to that in a few moments. So you have in Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you have thrilling things. I mean, in the Odyssey, you have, for instance, Odysseus finally getting home in disguise, talking to his servants, finding his son and his wife have been faithful, and then going with his son to slaughter all of the suitors, some of whom don't even seem that bad, frankly. But the point is here, these men have been eating off the substance of lost Odysseus. Penelope's not been very interested in them, but there they are. They have been parasites and pandas, and Achilles and Telemachus come to clear house. And you have the great moments of battle. You have the conniving gods, and you have the famous moments of disaster, the sirens, and Achilles has to be tied to the mast, and you have the eating of all of his crew, things like all these many things. You have the lotus eaters. You have all these famous passages that are redolent in our cultural memory, or once were, perhaps. You think it is a thing. You think that Adlai Stevenson, I think it's at the inauguration. No, it's at the DNC, not the inauguration. Perhaps in 1960, introduces Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, to the crowd by means of classical quotation, or classical reference. He in fact talks, and we'll talk about Demosthenes today. He compares Cicero to Demosthenes, and when he says, when Cicero sat down, they said how finely he spoke, but when Demosthenes spoke, they said, let us march. And so the point was that Stevenson spoke, referenced these sorts of authors, as did so many others, and the Iliad and the Odyssey are a source of so many of those things. So are these other epic poets. We have lost an enormous amount of the epic cycle, and that is our greatest loss, perhaps, to have early versions of these, as well as some of the later retellings by Hellenistic authors. I'll read one more sample. It's just the start of the 8th Olympian, the 8th Olympian by Pindar. For Alcimedon of Aegina, winner in the boys' wrestling. So here's the thing, you've got chariot racers who win. There are 4 great games, the Olympian, the Pythian, the Nemean, and the Isthmian. And you have, for instance, Alcimedon of Aegina, winner in the boys' wrestling, or Diagras of Rhodes, winner in the boxing, Hagaseus of Syracuse, winner of the mule race. The mule race sounds stressful, doesn't it? Lyric poetry has a different purpose to epic poetry. There is something, not that it can't be emotional or stirring, it often can be, but there is a stateliness and a majesty to the epic line. The hexameter in the Greek and the better translations, and in good prose translations too, that tries to represent the fact that these are, there is a high dealing with questions of the human heart. And I think that passage from Hector represents a lot of that, these weird tensions. The lyric poem is generally more focused. Sometimes it is light and comic, sometimes it is highly emotional. But Pindar is as good. The lyric poetry, I actually think, tends to struggle to be translated more than Homer. That seems controversial because surely Homer is more complex. But I think there is so much in the line of Homer that the competent translator can get across to you, whereas the lyric so often depends on the ear as much as on the mind. But here we go. Mother of gold-crowned games, Olympia, queen of truth, where men who are seers interpret burnt offerings and test the mind of Zeus of the flashing thunderbolt to see if he has any word for men who struggle in their hearts to win the rewards of excellence and respite from their labours. For men's prayers are fulfilled in accordance with their piety. O wooded grove of Pisa beside the Alpheus, I pray you welcome this victory revel, garlanded with crowns. Great forever will be the glory of the man who is honoured by your prize. Good fortune comes to men in many ways, and many are the paths to God-aided success. Timosthenes, destiny has allotted your clan to Zeus as its protector, who has brought you fame at Nemea and has made your brother Alcimedon an Olympic victor beside the hill of Cronus. Handsome to look upon, his deeds matched his beauty. For his victory, by his victory in the wrestling match, he proclaimed Aegina of the long oars as his fatherland, where Themis the saviour, throned beside Zeus, protector and stranger, is especially honoured among men. When much hangs in the balance and it inclines this way and that, a man may wrestle hard to make a straight, apt judgment. But some ordinance of the immortals has established this sea-bound land as a divine pillar of strength for strangers for every region. May future time never grow weary of this work. It is a land held in trust for the Dorian people, from the time of Iarchus, who was summoned by Leto's son and by wide-ruling Poseidon to help them build Troy's walls, as they prepared to crown it with defences. For it was fated that at war's onset, Troy would, in city-sacking battles, breathe forth gusts of angry smoke. When the city was nearly built, 3 great serpents tried to leap onto the wall. 2 fell back in terror and died there and then, but 1 leapt over with a triumphant cry. Apollo pondered this adverse omen, and at once spoke, Hero Iarchus, Pergamus will fall at this point where your hands have worked. This is what the vision sent by the loud thundering son of Cronus means to me. Your descendants will have a hand in this. It will begin in the 1st and 4th generations. So the god spoke clearly, and in haste drove his team off toward the Xanthus, to the Amazons with their fine horses, and to the Ister. But Poseidon, the trident wielder, urged his swift chariot towards the sea-lapped isthmus, returning Iarchus home behind his golden mares, while he himself went on to visit the mountain ridge of Corinth, famous for its festivals. What we get there, I think that there's what's fun here, and immediately captures us. You never want to deconstruct the experience of hearing too quickly, but what immediately captures us is, and which will point us towards the purpose of this at some level, is the reference to all these things about Aegina. And there's this man called Timosthenes. That's interesting, isn't it? And we have in our notes, let's go, we're on the 8th Olympic, aren't we? The 8th Olympium. Timosthenes, who is this? It is that Timosthenes is, does it tell us here? Alcimedon, he's the Timosthenes is also an Olympic, Nemean athlete, and probably the point is a politician at Aegina as well. He's probably a popular, well-regarded man, and Pindar may well have been paid in some way for this. That is to say, there may be consideration for these things. These are things praising great men, and here we have this great praise of Aegina and of the legends of Aegina. So we hear about the fact that it is Themis is an important goddess. We hear that it's held in trust for the Dorian people, so it refers to one of these 3 great tribes of the Greeks, and it tells us that Iarchus, the founder of this place, essentially the founder of the line, was part of the building of Troy. And then it recounts a legend that it's not in anything else. We have this legend of these serpents leaping over the walls, and then Apollo is just there. He's hanging out, just like Leto is. Just that's what we refer to by Leto's son. Sorry, he's hanging out there, and he's like, "Oh, I've worked this out. This means that your descendant will die there," because I believe Pergamus is Iarchus's son. No, sorry, son, great grandson or whatever. Sorry, not Pergamus. Hero Iarchus, Pergamus will fall at the point where your hands have worked. Pergamus, Troy, will fall where your hands have worked. So this is the point that you have upset this, and it will start in the generations from your time. We're told that his family line will continue to be significant, and that means that now down to this point in the 400s is when Pindar is composing. The Iarchus's line, and by that we mean his people, not his direct line, will still be important, because Alcimedon and indeed his brother Timosthenes will still be significant. They'll be winning games. And so you get this great praise, you get all these legends, you get this kind of rich, dense imagery, and and it's never really very emotional in the odes, in the sense of kind of, I really am caught up in the moment, as we may be in Homer or in some of the other lyric poets. But it's just wonderfully rich and enjoyable imagery, legend, and there's, within the lyric poets, there's so much for it. And by lyric, I include the other subtypes of that kind of poet. There's such a variety of styles. You have Theognis, the fairly unpleasant Theognis, and his imitators in the Theognidae. You have, as I say, the kind of satiric and somewhat philosophic people like Xenophanes or Simonides. You have love poetry. You have drinking poetry. That's a common subgenre. And yet, hopefully you hear also that some of these translations are listenable. They're not Milton in the English, as it were, but they are perfectly reasonable. They are enjoyable to listen to. Let's move on to drama. Drama basically consists of, again, I can show you more or less the whole surviving material. I've got potentially the wrong Sophocles here, but yeah, pretty much that is the whole of ancient Greek drama, classical Greek drama surviving, and that is three. Then we have fragments of other plays, obviously. I've mentioned that we have many fragments, but in terms of the surviving material, we have the great tragic poets, who are generally considered the three great ones, including in ancient times, though you read Aristotle's Poetics, and he'll mention several more. He mentions techniques used by others that are important and popular. But Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And one thing we see over this period, and with these men particularly, is the development of Greek drama. Greek drama before our period, and by that I mean at the start of our period, but before Aeschylus, who is he fights at Marathon, is it? He fights in the Persian Wars, basically. So in the early 400s. We see the development of this form of sacred dance on the festival of Dionysus. These religious playlets, like the miracle plays of medieval Europe, and these develop increasingly into, they split in fact, and the majority form it becomes the tragedy, a fairly serious and fairly set form, which has initially just one actor and a chorus. The chorus is the singers, and this is where we have, though it's a Latin term, the deus ex machina, the god in the machine. The idea that you have this weird stagecraft and you have stuff happen that reveal, and again Aristotle in the Poetics discusses all these techniques of early drama, and it comes out of the religious context, but increasingly takes on a, not secular in our sense, but secular in the sense of it's in the world. It's just something which normal people are talking about and going to see. There are great prizes for these things. And you see the introduction of first a second actor and then a third actor, so you can have more complex dramatic situations. And you can see, of course, the idea that you have a single speaker and a singing chorus certainly comes across as a bit religious, doesn't it? And then it develops. And you see this from Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, this process. We also have a few other remains from this era. The other part of the dramatic festival, of the festival of Dionysus, was the satyr. Basically, each trilogy would have a satyr play, which is, of course, pointing to the origin of the festival they are celebrating. We only have two significant surviving parts of them. I think is it that the Cyclops by Euripides is mostly complete, I believe, and the Ichnutai, the searching satyrs, is more fragmentary and less intact. These are somewhere between. I think a comparison, I think it might be one that Roger Lansdowne Green makes, is that they are more like the mystery plays. They are this kind of odd thing where there's something comic in them. There are comical elements, but they are not comedies. We do have, or at least they are not the kind of comedies we think of, particularly when we think of Aristophanes, the satirist. Now, Aristophanes is recognisably, and these are all Athenian, by the way, so here we have the fact that Homer and Hesiod and many of the lyric poets, they're spread all over the Greek world. Drama, in the early days, is this Athenian product, the product of this remarkable city-state, which becomes, as I say, functionally the imperial power for 50 years, 60 years. in the Eastern Mediterranean, despite an apparently absurd form of government where you randomly pick people to be in charge and they have to pay for it. It worked. But in this intense and intellectually vigorous city culture of the polis, the Greek polis, you have men like Aristophanes arise who can write essentially city comedies, even though it may well be about the all the the Trojan women or whoever it was, not the Trojan women, is it the Athenian women saying, oh, we have to make peace now or we won't have sex with you. The Trojan woman is Euripides and is much more depressing. Or you have the mockery of Socrates as just another kind of sophist out to scam people. So never was someone done more unjustly. The point is that you have these sort of, even where they are situations involving the gods, or situations involving figures from legend, or situations involving obvious farce, they are situations not of the epic or of the highly tragic and emotional, but with a comic twist. But they are of the... To say they're of the middle class is to misrepresent ancient Athens, but you can almost say they are of the educated middle class. They are the witty and texts full of bon mot and of humour and of contemporary battles and wars, amongst the social classes, but in words rather than in violence. I think yes, Aristophanes is an important complement. As I mentioned, his more famous rivals do not survive, but Aristophanes does seem to have been important, partly due to the way he survived, but also because I think what we see is he does engage with some of the issues at the time, and perhaps this is what caught posterity's imagination in a way that seems contemporary to us. Of the tragedians, Euripides tends to be the most burlesque, baroque, grim, strange, whereas the others, Aeschylus is quite high and sober, really, and Sophocles, I think, and I think about Oedipus Rex, the first Greek play I saw live, and being struck by the fact there really is a great deal, an overwhelming sense of quite real pathos in that play in Oedipus Rex. The idea of the righteous man whose own righteousness is the basis of a tragic fall, because he cannot give up the quest for justice against his father's killer. So yes, let's briefly quote, and this is actually me, I think, seeking to quote, just demonstrate maybe some of the question of translation specifically, rather than anything else, but just to give you a sense of the way in which these could be quite sober, serious texts that also, like the Iliad, begin to address, in the particular laboratory of Athens, the turn of Western civilization, if you want to call it that, from fighting, from the pure violence and drive to survive, to a place where you can begin to reflect, the place you can get a comedian like Aristophanes, but particularly in this case, a place that you can reflect on human tragedy. And so, for instance, this is an older translation famously quoted by Robert F. Kennedy after the death of Martin Luther King, and Aeschylus reflects, "In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." That's deeply powerful. This recognition of the clarifying nature of pain and suffering, but the fact that it is this inevitable result of human existence. It is, in its own way, not so far from Ecclesiastes. That deeply optimistic and positive book, which nonetheless starts from the point of vanity, tragedy, the passingness of things. This is how Fagles translates the same passage. This is one of the versions I have. I think the other one I possibly own is Moses Hadass or someone like that, an older one. So he reflects, talking about Zeus. He was Zeus and Cronus and so on. He who was so mighty once, storming for the wars of heaven. He has had his day, and then his son who came to power met his match in the third fall, and he is gone. Zeus, Zeus, raise your cries and sing him. Zeus the victor, you'll reach the truth. Zeus has led us on to know, the helmsman lays it down as law, that we must suffer into truth. We cannot sleep, and drop by drop at the heart the pain of pain remembered comes again. And we resist, but ripeness comes as well. From the gods enthroned on the awesome rowing bench, there comes a violent love. So there, a useful thing there is, of course, with the expanded quote, that we understand this is set as an analogy that is being given via the experience of the gods. The three generations, Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus. And Zeus tries the same thing on, by the way, in terms of eating his kids, and it requires Athena sorting that out. But you can hear that Fagles, there's an important thing there. I read the Iliad in Fagles' voice, and you can hear the same with the Agamemnon, that there is just a lightness to it that in that older, more stately version is lacking, but it's not a lack, it's just a difference. But just subtle differences, pain falling drop by drop upon the heart, or here, where were we? Let's just pass our way back to it. Pain of pain remembered comes again. There are these slightly different ways of expressing it. So translation gives us, but then maybe that's a strength, is that you can read these different translations. But these are serious topics in the tragedies, and I think a good place to start would be something like the Agamemnon or the Oedipus Rex. Certainly, I do think Euripides is in some ways a more acquired taste for some, though certainly he was as popular or more popular than the others, and has been over various periods of time. So drama as the product of the full flower of Athenian democratic society, and the complex development of religion, democracy, Athens as a political power in the region, all come together. And it's a very powerful thing, I think. And it's not as if those sentiments, this is an important point, have those sentiments died? When we say, oh, is this merely a historic exercise to read the great books and to, simply say, oh, well, great, I've read historical things. No, they are things we can still delight in and learn from. And one of those things is, when we talk particularly about poetry, drama, is that we can learn permanent truths about the human experience. We can hear them in new and fresh ways, and we can hear them as if they were being spoken on our ear, not by a man dead for 2,500 years, but by someone here with me today who has suffered the same things as I do. And, whether it's that they put the words into a character's mouth, perhaps, but we know, don't we, that Aeschylus has experienced what so many of us have. This older man who has seen so much, who has seen war and has seen peace, and will live, I think, just to see war again, consume Greece this time, between Greek upon Greek. And he is putting this process of learning that is only completed with death. Call no man happy until he is dead. So yes, that's Greek drama, and I would, as I say, perhaps start with Agamemnon or the Oedipus Rex, or if you're into a comedy, Lysistrata, which is the women all refusing to have sex until peace is made. The section that, in a sense, I think we'll get a reading in, I think, but the section which is going to be perhaps one of the least interesting, but is not in fact the least interesting, is philosophy. I say least interesting because it is very hard to, unless one is specifically trying to talk about and introduce Greek philosophy as its own thing, as opposed to in the kind of discussion we're having, it's very hard to simply say, oh, well, this is what's exciting about Greek philosophy. One can say it is novel, it is doing new things, it is a departure. Greek philosophy, and it is those things. This is the majority, the vast majority of surviving archaic and classical Greek philosophy. There is in terms of selection, we have a very interesting selection mechanic going on to do with the most important set of productions of the era, which is the Socratic dialogues by the many followers of Socrates, and we have two key survivors with large amounts of work. We have Plato, who's here, and we have Xenophon, who we have a couple of things by here. And these are very different men, and it's very interesting to see their quite different recollections at points of Socrates, a man they both knew very well and loved. But there are others who wrote about him, but we have fragmentary quotations or nothing at all. So when we talk about selection mechanics, philosophy, what it tells us, I don't know, but it certainly tells us something. The main, these are, as I say, the main surviving works. There is one other, perhaps worth considering, which I do not own a physical copy of, which I'll mention at its due time. We talk about, and as I say, the important thing is with Greek philosophy is that you have, for the first time in the West, and at a remarkably similar time to the flourishing of organised reflective thought in China, and in the much more settled period post the Indo-Aryan invasions, as things settled down in India, there is a great flowering of philosophy in the middle of the first millennium BC. And in India, this takes many forms, but some of the most famous you might think would be the Buddha and Mahavira, for instance, who are these great reformist critics of the status quo at that time. And there are other traditions too. And in China, as I say, the great texts are chiefly composed in that period, basically through the is it the spring and autumn period? One of our experts on ancient China may correct me, and then into the Warring States. Basically, in that period, you get all these things being written: the great schools, the Confucians, and the Taoists, and the legalists, and the Mohists. They're all founded, and you get the great texts of those schools, and you have other things like the art of war. So you have these rising at the same time, and then all across the Greek world in the same period, in the 400s basically, maybe just about from 500 onwards, you have this great flowering of thought, and you have it particularly significant flowerings in southern Italy, in Magna Graecia, in Greater Greece, and on the Asian coast, and that's where it starts. The kind of the fringes of the Greek world in many ways, and we then basically call these philosophers the pre-Socratics, and this is an accurate name because they are before Socrates. And we have, this collection by Kathleen Freeman is 160 pages. It is long enough in that sense. But here's the thing that we have to sum up the kind of thing, the quality of things we're talking about at points is, for instance, Theagenes of Rhegium. We have a single piece of information we're given. He was the first scholar known to have applied the allegorical method of interpretation to Homer. No writings survive. 529 to 522 is a fluoret for him. That's not very much to go by, and indeed even that can be disputed. I wrote a PhD on the subject of ancient allegories, so I've read the disputes. Archaic of Argos we have more of. We have, how many fragments do we have by him? 41, one of which is doubtful. Of these, most are not fragments. They are comments about him, that he says that Eros was the son of night and ether, that the fleece was not golden but dyed purple by the sea, that Heracles died in the fire. I take it that's the fire of the shirt and Nessus, I don't know. We do have one actual quote from him: Poseidon united with Caine, daughter of Elatus, afterwards, since she did not wish to have a child by him or anyone else. So you can see, the point is you have all kinds of materials here, but what we draw particularly from the pre-Socratic period is not, these all these authors, and they've got all these random bits of quotes, mostly about pieces of, relatively literally trivial points. But by that I mean just, here's a bit of mythological information, here's a historical fact. Interesting, but not vital. We do begin to see the first great questions in this period that found a Western intellectual tradition, which I'll maybe comment on more in just a moment, but which has a particular kind of form of inquiry, which I do think is distinct from my experience as a strict outsider and amateur of reading other intellectual traditions. It has a different form of inquiry. Now, the general principle of, I think logic does seem to be a fairly universal mechanic in some sense. By that I mean the almost mathematical verification. But the exact way that you frame these things, and to some degree the importance of authorities in deciding these things, how, all things are ultimately decided by some form of authority. What is the authority that decides it? It's different. And I think in the Greek intellectual tradition, you have an increasing question of things like, people are interested in, okay, so we've got a world, we've got man. What is it all about? Where does it all come from? What is it all made of? Questions, physicists comes from phusos, the stuff that everything is made of. They are physicists and metaphysicists. They are people who are asking questions about how everything comes together, the why, and the big hows, not the kind of little hows of how do black holes work, but the big hows of how would anything ever emerge from nothing. These big philosophical questions. And so you have one set of philosophers who are interested in, perhaps everything comes from earth or from water or from air or from fire, the elements. Maybe there's a mixture of all elements going on. And then there's another very important debate, and this, we have two very famous illustrations from this, which I'll share. You have the great debate about essentially what is reality and what is being. And you have Heraclitus, who says everything is change. You cannot step in the same river twice. The river is gone. And been intermixed. You can't chase it either, because it's then a different river, because it's somewhere else. It's got different rocks underneath. It's got a different mixture of things, different fish in it. So, this all seems kind of almost fableish to us in some ways, I suppose. These kind of, these people are saying, was everything made of fire? What on earth? And of course, this is proto-science in some ways, in our understanding of that word. It's asking, well, what's the base, and it's atomic theory, what's the basic stuff? And it's saying the question about change or about stasis is a pretty important one, because it has to do with the fact that for things to make sense, everyone comes up with an explanation for why things are and why things make sense and why death happens, or I don't know what's the purpose of life. And these preliminary questions of, for instance, if everything is change all the time, then our response to the mutability of life is going to be different to if we just accept that as just the universal constant, than if we think that change is an unfortunate introduction, or indeed, in the case of the Eleatic school, if it is an illusion. What a remarkable, fun idea! The idea that it is just made up, that Parmenides and Zeno end up with. I mean, do we actually have a version of it under Zeno here? You get Zeno's turtle, don't you? The idea that, well, what happens if one person is chasing another, one animal is chasing another? Have Parmenides of Elea, and they are having to catch up, and they're carving the distance every minute, let's say. It doesn't really matter. And the point of Zeno coming up with this was not an interesting fable-like explanation of some truth about morality, but to say, but the animal chasing is never going to catch up. Never going to catch up. It doesn't matter that you're chasing and they're slower than you, the turtle's slower, and you're halving the distance, because there'll always be a distance to halve. And you can say, well, we've come up with an explanation for that since. I have had mathematicians tell me this quite earnestly, but there's surely just something quite stalling about the idea that Parmenides and Zeno, vastly more intelligent men than I am, I'm sure, just thought, do you know what? Nothing really changes. Change is illusory. There are philosophical problems with this indeed as well. But substance itself does not really change. Perhaps accident, and you can get into a substance and accident conversation, something like that. But the real stuff never changes, even though it seems to. So the pre-Socratics talking about these things. You also got people, your Xenophanes and other people like that, who are saying things like the gods aren't worth worshipping. They're fakes, or they're evil. They're real, but they're evil. And this is the thing, you get forward into the later classical and into the Hellenistic period, and these kinds of questions about how to deal with the gods become increasingly important, famously from Socrates onwards. Are, as in Epicurean thought, are the gods real but separate from us completely? Are they essentially, should you adopt a pose of universal skepticism towards all things? Should you see the gods as metaphors for other things, perhaps within a monotheistic worldview, which that's the increasing trend is towards, certainly is amongst pre-Socratics and Socrates and others, towards some sort of monotheism, if it is not what we would recognise as monotheism. And these questions start there. And these are a different set of questions, I think, and a different process of inquiry to what you see if you read the Analects or the writings of Mozi. There is a different approach in those documents and a different form of posing the question based on authority and based on cause. And so the Western intellectual tradition starts here. And though it may feel like these questions are answered, I feel ever so cautious about the fact that we have largely answered them by abandoning kind of underpinning ideas and assuming that means we've answered those ideas. That's simply not the case. The fact that some of the most rigorous and robust traditions that have ever existed and still exist are based on these. I'm thinking a really obvious one in terms of an incredibly large and coherent body of thinking is the Thomist tradition, which is an Aristotelian tradition. So yes, even the pre-Socratics are relevant, but then we can get on to call them the Socratics, and this is Plato and Xenophon. And Xenophon is a bluff old cove who also is a historian, and will come up there in a moment. But he's a historian, and he is a philosopher, and he's an economist, and he's a horseman. And he loves Socrates, and he tells us one thing we know that definitely happened in Socrates' life, because Xenophon and Socrates agree on it, is that Socrates refused to defend himself at his trial because his genius, his angel, something like that, told him not to, and this had some purpose. But otherwise, they disagree widely. Socrates in the dialogues of Plato will often say things like, "What's this civic tradition good for? I don't understand." Or, "Are you sure about this? Worshipping the gods like that? Why would you do that?" Or, Homer, well, very interesting, but also immoral. Whereas Xenophon would just have Socrates quote Homer quite happily. Socrates in Xenophon is not particularly politically radical, because Xenophon was not. He learnt a great deal from Socrates, but he did not have Plato's streak of political radicalism, whereas Plato never forgives Athens for having functionally killed Socrates. Which is all caught up in the history of the Peloponnesian War and the fact that some of Socrates' disciples led the pro-Spartan puppet government after the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, which overthrew their sacred democracy. And when they had been overthrown in turn, Socrates eventually got dragged up on charges of atheism, i.e. he believed in one god, not many, and of corrupting the youth, i.e. teaching them things which might lead them to be oligarchs, being sceptical of democracy. So yes, you have these, and this in these two writers, and Xenophon writes other things, as to be fair, Plato does not always write in Socratic dialogue either, but in these writers you have this great tradition of the Socratic dialogue and the Socratic method, the idea that Socrates asks questions to help elicit the truth from people's own mouths. He says, what about this? What about this? A drawing out method of education. And Socrates, though he is nearly always right and smug and difficult, he is at points these are funny and entertaining, and compared to the kind of very fragmentary remains of the pre-Socratics, you can really chew into these. And I think Plato still rewards, both of them reward reading, but Plato still rewards a sort of aesthetic reading too. The Euthyphro or the Ion can be actively funny. The Republic, though long, it's fascinating, imaginatively fascinating as well as intellectually fascinating. The kind of constructs. I'll see if I can find, because philosophy is essentially almost pointless to quote for the specific reason. I would argue that you have to quote a whole section of argument if you're really going to get down to business, and that means that realistically you're not, because when you're saying, oh, what's a quick quote from this, you can simply come up with a quote about that the best should rule, and you think, yes, that sounds good, but you don't know the context of the Republic. Now, the Republic is the vast masterwork of Plato. I wouldn't recommend starting with the Republic, but perhaps something like the Euthyphro is a very obvious one, partly because the question there is, are things just because the gods tell us they're just? And if the gods say, do this crazy thing, that means it's just? Or are things just so the gods must do them too, or follow them too? In which case the gods themselves are not the font of wisdom and authority. And this is very disruptive and deconstructive. And it's an entertaining dialogue, a funny dialogue, but it's also one that raises a very serious question about the source of morality in a polytheistic world, by Plato as a monotheist of some form, and Socrates of some form, perhaps a different form, who knows, very complicated. By monotheist, I'm using that term loosely for the experts. You will understand what I mean. The point is that this is very disruptive, and it's fairly short as well, whereas the Republic is book length. It is as long as a book. Now, if we talk about, just a quick example is the famous allegory of the cave by Plato. And here, Plato is like, oh, well, let's talk about the difference between education and the lack of it on our nature. Imagine this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling. This is Socrates in the words of Plato. One thing, of course, by the way, is that sometimes we're going to have actual records of something like the conversation Socrates actually had in other places, or a conversation like a conversation he had. And there's whole discussions about eras of Plato's writing and types of Plato's writing. But it's not as if Xenophon is therefore more historical. Xenophon also has strong political and philosophical interests. But the point is that sometimes it may be very close to what Socrates actually said. But in the Republic, we're largely talking about Plato's ideas. The fact that Plato comes up with an entire idea of either more or less the first described totalitarian state, where you can call it fascist or communist. It has redolence of both of those odours. But the point is that really Plato is at this point talking about his own ideas. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads round. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also by them on higher ground there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. And now you have, I think this is Glaucon, one of the interlocutors. I'm imagining it. Then also imagine there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artefacts that project about it. Statues of people and other animals, made out of stone, wood and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. It's a strange image you're describing, and strange prisoners. They're like us. Do you suppose, first of all, these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another beside the shadows that the fire cast on the wall in front of them? How could they if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout life? What about the things being carried along the wall? Isn't the same true of them? Of course. And if they could talk to each other, don't you think they'd suppose the names they used apply to the things that are passing before them? They'd have to. By that we mean the fire-lit silhouettes of stuff that isn't even real. It's just kind of depictions of it. What if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? Don't you think they believed the shadows passing in front of them were talking about whatever one of the carriers passing on the wall was talking about? I certainly do. That the prisoners would in every way believe their truth is nothing other than the shadows of these artefacts. They must surely believe that. Consider then what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like if something like this came to pass. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled, unable to see the thing whose shadows he had seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he had seen before was inconsequential, but that now, because he's a bit closer to the things that are and is turned towards things that are more, he sees more correctly? Or to put it another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by, asked him what each of them is, and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss, and that he believed the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he is now being shown? Much truer. If someone compelled him to look at the light itself, wouldn't his eyes hurt, and wouldn't he turn around and flee towards the things he'd been able to see, believing they're really clearer than the things he's being shown? He would. We'll leave that there. For Plato, you get both the style, this kind of back and forth, where usually the questioner is either being tripped up by Plato, Socrates, or giving more information or agreeing. And here we have this rather remarkable illustration of approaching truth is not always self-evidently more truthful, because it may blind one at first. If we are ignorant, and for Plato and probably for Socrates, the root of sin, if we want to call it that, is ignorance, is not knowing what is good, then education may be good, it may draw us closer to truth, but it may not always be welcomed. And this is Plato's point here, is he's talking about the fact that the process of bringing people to the truth is slow and painful, like our Aeschylus quote, but in a different context. And it will take generations, in fact, perhaps. But there is this process. This is the kind of discussion, the second half of the Republic. So yes, the Republic is a masterwork. The Laws is another very important big Plato work. But I'd start with the Euthyphro. Finally, Aristotle. Aristotle is, in some ways, the triumphant. Here is his complete. This is the Princeton Bollingen series 2, edited by Jonathan Barnes. I have edited in 2 volumes. Aristotle is in some ways the master. He is in some ways the great triumph of philosophically the whole ancient world. But in philosophy, the sense of the lovers of wisdom, that's what it means. Those who inquire in that particular Greek manner that is adopted by many Romans and is influential on the Christian tradition as well. And Aristotle is, as I say, the master in many ways. He is the teacher. He's called the teacher in later eras, and indeed he teaches Alexander. Alexander the Great, though, to what fruit, who knows? He is this kind of great educator. He is himself a Macedonian who moves to Athens and learns from Plato at the academy. But he is incredibly wise and intelligent and thorough and very keen to list things. I remember we were reading the categories just a few months ago, where you're thinking he's just talking about all the kinds of things you can speak about or that there are, just in case. And actually this is an important preliminary work to this vast work he has, where sometimes he'll be talking about what are all the kinds of plants you can have or animals and how can they work and what motivates them. And then of course this leads you to be able to talk about humans and politics and ethics, and you can also talk about metaphysics and how everything must exist, and for him as a combination of form and substance. And in ethics, the fact that excellence is a habit, what a great lesson to take away, the fact you have to keep doing something to become good at it. And by that means morally as well as anything else. These many powerful and important sentiments, and a very rich philosophical tradition. The difficulty with Aristotle is that Plato is quite entertaining and Aristotle is not. Aristotle is fairly thorough and analytic and in some senses dry. I don't always find him dry to read. I think you can be reading passages of the ethics which carry you along because there is a very compelling vision of human behaviour. That's, as an example, the politics, very compelling passages about the development of human politics. And one of his great political ideas you'll find not just in politics but elsewhere is this idea that naturally humans, rather than it being this state of ignorance that progresses into eventually, via the totalitarian state of Plato's Republic, into wisdom and philosopher kings, you have a monarchy that devolves into tyranny, and tyranny that devolves into, improves in some ways into into aristocracy, the rule of the best, and then that devolves into a sort of oligarchy where just powerful people rule and they're not necessarily the best. And then there's democracy where everyone participates, and he's a lot more open to the idea that there might be some kind of way of having a healthy democracy. And then that devolves into ochlocracy, the mob rule, where simply the number of voices matters. And so these are very important insights, and at points can be quite exciting is the wrong word, but compellingly and clearly framed. At other points you are like, okay, I'm reading this prolegomenal work, or I'm reading this list, or I'm reading this quite technical discussion And I think, it's not like he's the only author, the only, even quite powerful writers. I think about Burke, one of the most powerful writers in English ever, also has kind of long, complex lists of sensation on the sublime and the beautiful, where you're like, okay, this is actually pretty hard yakka. And I think, Aristotle can be. And so it's a funny one that it is harder to say to someone, yes, just pick up the politics and read it. In a sense, yes, just do that. But I think in terms of ancient Greek, classical, archaic Greek philosophy, the obvious starting point amongst all of that then is going to be Plato. Something shorter from Xenophon, like the Apology. Reading the two Apologies together is a well worthwhile activity. But reading something like the Euthyphro by Plato, reading summaries of the kind of arguments of people like Heraclitus about change, or Parmenides and Zeno about stasis, about the fact that things cannot really change because mathematically, you can't actually have kind of things change position. Numbers are just numbers. You can add stuff together, but that's not really change. That just is then the other number. All these kinds of things. That quite weird and compelling ideas, reading epitomes of that, and then progressing. I would say it is, generally speaking, just better to read the primary sources. But yeah, and then perhaps progressing on to some of these bigger books, the Republic, or with Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Politics. Particularly the metaphysics is a step above again. So you have an important thing here, which still, when we think about how most people talk about knowledge and the gaining of knowledge, you have scientists and the scientific method, which at its certainly at its purest really does draw on this. But even the critical, think about kind of critical theory and the continental method. And that kind of stream in philosophy. It's not as if this is wholly alien. You could say, oh no, it's very different, because these people think knowledge can just be discovered via deduction and this and that, and they're not aware of the power dynamics. As if, let us be clear that your whether it is your Derrida or it is your existentialist, your Sartre, whatever else, anyone talking about language and the grappling with discovering truth. I mean, existentialism is all about one way or the other, whether it's a theistic or an atheistic existentialism, grappling with the ground truth that may or may not be palatable. It may be very unpalatable. Having come to some conclusion and having to define meaning in that context, or having realized that language, you look at your Foucault and your Derrida, that stuff is all about power dynamics. That itself is a profoundly Western tradition formulation, and it profoundly draws upon these ancient authors, and deeply, even where it would rather not. And so I think you have a great deal of relevance there in philosophy. Finally, this is the end of a long run, but let's talk about history, oratory, and politics. And here, the reason that these all fall together, as lazy as that may seem, as if I'm cheating, is because the people generally did the same stuff, and some of it, the point is one tends to be the other, not wholly. Now, historia just means, I guess, story, events, narrative, functionally. And the point is that in Greece and in Greek, we have the first things that look like our idea of history. And by that I mean, generally speaking, the narration, the continual narration, not as list points, but the continual narration of human events with some attempt to divine both meaning and relevance. And we have two great, we actually really have, I'd say there's a third very important, though perhaps less famous strictly, historian of this period. Actually, sorry, I've forgotten one philosopher. This is the one I don't have a physical copy of because I always use library copies. The Devaney author. This is, again, a more advanced text in a sense because it's somewhat damaged and therefore you're reading a partly reconstructed text. But it is a commentary upon a poem of Pseudo-Orpheus or Orpheus by a philosopher, attempting to find the mysteries in this sacred text. And it points us towards a future tradition that's very important that we already begin to see in Plato and his discussion both critically and for and against this kind of way of approaching sacred texts, particularly in the Republic, that is. But yeah, the Devani author, this was a 20th century find in a grave in Macedonia, but it's a 5th century document, so it's one of our older ones actually, but of this Orphic commentary on this, what seems to be originally just a religious text, but then someone is saying, this now refers to this, or this tells us this about the nature of the universe and the mysteries. And yes, so it is a slightly more obscure and difficult text, but very interesting, and well worth looking at as you go along that. Derveni, Devani. So now, history, yes, that's what we're saying. The two most famous ones amongst historians, those giving the continuous narrative of human events, divining their causes and their meaning, Herodotus and Thucydides. And Herodotus has a vast gossipy tale, including ants carrying gold around in Pakistan, and all kinds of mad things about maybe this tradition came from this insane reason, or maybe it didn't, or hey, I'm just speculating, or I'm just reporting what I was told. Herodotus has a lot of fun, but he's also interested in, he's giving this vast narrative, and he's talking about Croesus and Midas and all the rest. He wants to, he tells lots of legendary stories of the backgrounds of locations, because he's trying to get to the point of explaining how it was that Greece and Persia came to war, and how mighty Persia was humbled by tiny Greece at Marathon and at Plataea, I guess. And he wants to talk about the kind of the rise of this Greek people to great prominence. Thucydides has a similar cause, really, the history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, essentially, he's a general during the earlier stages of the war as a relatively young man, and he's reflecting on how it has all gone wrong for Athens. Athens loses, we know that, and hence the oligarchy comes in the 30, and hence they're overthrown and punished and so on. And then Socrates, eventually, the Democrats catch up with Socrates, and that leads Plato to decide that you need a totalitarian state if you're really going to teach anyone anything. Thucydides is trying to work out what led to Athens' fall, and perhaps if there are lessons for the future. Now, these lessons are often ambivalent, but yes, there is a third historian amongst these to cite, which is that Xenophon wrote a couple of quite important histories: the Cyropaedia, the Anabasis, and the Hellenica. The Hellenica is a continuation of the history of the Peloponnesian War. It is Xenophon, who's younger than Thucydides, writing, sometime later, some decades afterwards, after the whole Spartan stuff has ended and after Thucydides is dead, to say what happened since in my time in Greece. And it is something where he is a good narrator. The Anabasis and the Cyropaedia have to do with his engagement in Persian internal politics, and his famous the March of the 10,000, of which Xenophon was one. So there is a great deal of this old, intelligent chap, not really as analytic as a Thucydides, in the same way that, though he has his own philosophy, his Socratic dialogues are not as piercing as Plato's. But he is worth considering in that light. But yes, Thucydides is in some ways the first historian, and I kind of hinted it there, from Herodotus being terribly gossipy and just trying to come up with a story of how amazing my people are, and Xenophon saying, here's my memories at least. Thucydides thinks that history is a way to understand ourselves and to understand not just what we need to understand what's happened. Think about Santayana, and those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Things like that. The idea that we can learn from history, and that history, therefore, this is one thing also that Thucydides cares about, the idea that though there are literary devices which are alien to us, Thucydides, and I'll quote one in a second, will just invent speeches. But invent does not here mean fake. No one reading it believes that all these speeches made by people were set exactly like that. When he gives the Athenians negotiating with the Melians in one of the most famous, and it's philosophy indeed, about the idea of whether might makes right or not, and whether or not what happens in earthly politics matches up with heavenly politics, as it were, and whether or not Athens deserved a good hiding for its behaviour. no one's pretending, and no one at the time thought that stuff was exactly said, but Thucydides puts in a fitting way to make it clear what's going on. So yes, anyway, the point is that he thinks that basically recounting actual history and trying to analyse actual facts matters. And again, though this is not unique, it's not as if around the world no one ever worked out any history beforehand. The point is, if you look at the written documents, typically, of course, in this very period in stone in South America, you still have a complex and ritualized intermixture of that which is directly human in experience and that which is part of the mythic cycle, and which was profoundly true to the people talking about it. But I'm talking about, for Thucydides, he's like, yes, nothing to do with religion here, there's nothing against that, but and we must discuss the influence of the gods on things, but the point is that we need to understand what we did and how human actions interacted with all these other events. So it leaves the mythic cycle, it leaves the ritual cycle, and enters our idea of history. So yes, I'll read from this, and then we'll talk about one final subtopic, and then we'll finish for today. We have Pericles giving the funeral oration for the war dead of the year, and he stands up. Pericles tells Xanthippus, "Many of those who have spoken here in the past have praised the institution of this speech." This is a thing that happens every year. At the close of our ceremony, it seems to them a mark of honour to our soldiers who have fallen in war that a speech should be made over them. I do not agree. These men have shown themselves valiant in action, and it would be enough, I think, for their glories to be proclaimed in action, as you've just seen it done at this funeral organised by the state. Our belief in the courage and manliness of so many should not be hazarded on the goodness or badness of one man's speech. Then it is not easy to speak with a proper sense of balance when a man's listeners find it difficult to believe in the truth of what one is saying. The man who knows the facts and loves the dead may well think the narration tells less than what he knows and what we'd like to hear. Others who do not know so much may feel envy for the dead and think the orator overpraises them when he speaks of exploits that are beyond their own capacities. Praise of other people is tolerable only up to a certain point, the point where one still believes that one could do oneself some of the things one is hearing about. Once you get beyond this point, you will find people becoming jealous and incredulous. However, the fact is that this institution was set up or approved by our forefathers, and it is my duty to follow the tradition and do my best to meet the wishes and expectations of every one of you. I shall begin by speaking about our ancestors, since it is only right and proper on such an occasion to pay them the honour of recalling what they did. In this land of ours there have always been the same people living from generation to generation up till now, and they, by their courage and their virtues, have handed it on to us, a free country. They certainly deserve our praise, even more so do our fathers deserve it, for to the inheritance they had received they added all the empire we have now, and it was not without blood and toil they handed it down to us of the present generation. And then we ourselves, assembled here today, who are mostly in the prime of life, have in most directions added to the power of our empire, and have organised our state in such a way that it is perfectly well able to look after itself both in peace and in war. I have no wish to make a long speech on subjects familiar to you all, so I shall say nothing about the warlike deeds by which we acquired our powers on the battle, or the battles in which we or our fathers gallantly resisted our enemies, Greek or foreign. What I want to do is, in the first place, to discuss the spirit in which we faced our trials, and also our constitution, and the way of life which has made us great. After that, I shall speak in praise of the dead, believing the kind of speech is not inappropriate to the present occasion, and this whole assembly of citizens and foreigners may listen to it with advantage. Let me say that our system of government does not copy the institutions of our neighbours. It is more the case of our being a model to others than of our imitating anyone else. Our constitution is called a democracy because the power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. No one, so long as he has had it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty. And just as our political life is free and open, so is our day-to-day life in our relations with each other. We do not get into a state with our next-door neighbour if he enjoys himself his own way, nor do we give him the kind of black looks which, though they do no real harm, still do hurt people's feelings. We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the law ourselves, especially those which are for the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. This may sound overfamiliar to you. You may have heard people who you do not think mean this say it before or after elections. But the point here is that this is many things for Thucydides. This is him reflecting what he actually believes Pericles believed. It is in Thucydidean style. It may have been based on an actual oration, but we know he used some documents, but it's something which one could reasonably feel was glossed up, even if it was taken from an original. But the point is, Pericles here says things like, look, I can't praise this guy. This is much like King in the Ender novels. He has spoken for himself in this. These men have spoken for themselves. But what I can talk about is us. I can talk about where we've come from. And it's interesting talks, our ancestors have secured this and handed it on to our fathers, and our fathers have improved it and handed it on to us. And we have tried in most ways to improve that. And let's say what those things we are have. And he starts with the fact that it's a democracy, that the many. Now, Athens was not a universal suffrage democracy. It was a male citizen democracy. And that means that slaves and foreigners did not have the vote in the assembly and could not take these roles. Equally, it was preferable to be rich if you were going to take on public office, because then you could pay for stuff. And prestige came from that. Part of your aristeia essentially was that you paid for stuff. So the point is that he is saying, this is our system. And now, did it always measure up in reality to that? No, but that's part of Thucydides' point. The point is that Thucydides is saying, look, our civilization is great, but we have not lived up to the standards of our forefathers, and we have lost it by turning away from this. The fact that when it says, we leave each other alone in private, but in public we obey the law, and we do not shame ourselves with oppressing people or with doing shameful things in public. Now the point is that he will present and has presented that Athens does do shameful things and does break the law of nations. What it says to Melians, where it says the Athenians say might makes right and seem to be proven right, but eventually toppled in their turn. Actually, Thucydides is saying, are you really sure? Is this not exactly what has led to your downfall that you believe this? Thucydides is using history as a teacher, the law as a teacher, and history as a teacher. And so that is a key thing in the development of the Western idea of history, and it comes from these Greeks. And it is something where he is trying to say not just our legendary ritual cycle tells us, which we may believe in different ways or whatever, but knowable recent fact tells us in these precise ways based on these actual events that you can go and talk to people where it happened and greater truth may be adduced. And this reminds us, and should remind us, of the roughly contemporary pre-Socratics and then Socrates, who inquire after the world in a disputatious and discursive manner. Finally, I think I've just got Greek political oratory is the collection I have. There are there was the 10 Attic orators. This particular collection has Demosthenes, Isocrates, and Lysias is, I'm not sure if Androcedes is, off the top of my head. Certainly you also have Isaias and Aeschines are others of the 10. The reason that these kind of fall, they're half politics, half oratory. Some of their speeches are mostly famous as oratory, as beautiful examples of speech, some as important political speeches, and some are philosophy too. Socrates did all of these, and many of these men were rivals in Athens. Again, the great flowering of Athens. Most of these authors we're speaking about were either from Athens or heavily associated with Athens, and this shows the vitality of that particular place, doesn't it? But yes, this is really the last full measure, along with Aristotle, who is not an Athenian, but through a large part of his life is there. The last full measure of Athenian society, the last flowering of its greatness. even though the academy continues for 700, 800 years, something like that, 700 years, I think. But what we have here is a few great men from this tiny society that produces so many great men. The idea that a highly concentrated form of society can produce greatness from fairly small numbers. You see this in sport, incidentally. You find these Balkan countries of 5 millions or something who come second in the World Cup, that sort of thing. But yes, Demosthenes is the most famous of these. I say Isocrates probably after that. And as you can see, Thucydides is doing the same. He is showing an earlier part, perhaps an earlier passage of that tradition with his speeches. And this is an important, influential tradition, because to talk about Thucydides, or indeed to talk about Demosthenes, you see this spread all the way forward to the Book of Acts, and the way that the Apostle Luke writes the various sermons in that is profoundly oratorical. There's an intentional thing where here he's presenting sermons saying what early Christian leaders, including the people he's speaking about, will have said, but saying it in these particularly convincing and well-written Greek forms, so that it is, he's saying, look, this is the message, and I'm presenting it to my readers, the learned Theophilus, in a particular way. So partly we have a very important step on the way towards that part of the wider tradition, but also you have here a very impressive set of individuals, heavily concentrated in this case in Attica, in Athens, but really working out a lot of things. Demosthenes, just to pull quote, the idea that free states do not, basically do not stay free very long, the longer they work with tyrants, or find your own translation of that. He's mostly famous for his Philippics, is Demosthenes. He doesn't seem like he's the easiest man the whole time, but a very good speaker, impressive speaker, and particularly he tried to warn Greece about the fact that Philip was not going to be happy with being the protector of Greece. He wanted to be the controller of Greece, and this turned out to be the case. And Greece would be extinguished as the sort of classical Greece it had been. It became a vastly bigger civilization in a sense due to Philip and Alexander, but it ceased to be the Greece it had been, the Greece of the city-state and the excellent, in that sense, the aristocratic few rising from fairly small populations in this very barren, difficult land, who created all these things we've talked about. He knew this would happen, and he tried to speak against Philip, and he, though Greece half listened to him, Greece lost. Just to read a small bit of the second Philippic to finish. Gentlemen, when debates are held on Philip's intrigues and deliberate breaches of the peace, the Athenian point of view is conspicuous for its correct and humane attitude. Attacks made on Philip are invariably commendable, but there is nothing to commend in the action taken, nothing to justify the arguments used. Indeed, the whole position for the country has reached a point at which the more strongly and openly Philip is convicted of breaches of the treaty with Athens, and of designs against the Greek states in general, the harder it becomes to advise on policy. The reason is twofold. At a time when practical measures, not words, are essential to curb aggression, we, your advisers, avoid action, legislation and practical proposals because we are afraid of public resentment and prefer tirades on Philip's unjustifiable proceedings. Our audience here, on the other hand, is better equipped than Philip to impart and listen to justifiable argument, yet against his present course of action offers complete inertia. The result is inevitable, I suppose, and perhaps right. We each succeed best in the field of our greatest activity and interest. Philip in the field of action, Athens in the field of words. If you are still content merely to have right on your side, there is no difficulty. It will cost you no exertion, but if means are to be taken to improve the position, to prevent a still further unsuspected deterioration, then our old approach needs to be entirely changed. There must be a movement on the part of speakers and audience alike towards effective practical measures, and away from the path of ease and complacency. He is a fine, fine writer, fine expresser. And he gives us a picture in a way that we have very few pictures before that. Thucydides is not recording all the contemporary debates exactly. He is, and the lyric poets, where they are engaging, or the hexametrical poets indeed, where they are engaging with some contemporary philosophical or even political issues, is so fragmentary and narrow. Whereas here we have in the orators in general, but most at its peak in Demosthenes, accepted as the, remember, here we go, when Cicero spoke, they would say, what fine speech, but when Demosthenes spoke, they said, let us march. As the most convincing and effective speaker, the man who not, who may have lost for that time, but passes on what he had to give. And there we have the fact that it points towards a way of doing politics, which was frankly not always very pleasant, but I cannot say was always much more unpleasant than how we do things now, and who shows the erudition and excellence that could be desirable in that role. And yes, I think that's valuable. So yes, that is a kind of overview and introduction to the great books of classical and archaic Greece. And of course it's a selection, and of course it is only one perspective on that selection, and only one kind of set of information about that. But hopefully it is useful for you, and hopefully you found it interesting. And I do ask for your reflections, comments, corrections, alternative views, or people should read this or this instead, in the comments. And yes, I'll be continuing. The next couple would be on languages, and that will be probably a relatively short one, I think, but just to kind of talk about the value of learning language. And then on, I think, Hellenistic Greece next, which is the next period of, because it precedes and informs Latin language, Roman literature. Anyway, there we go. Till next time.